Good morning, everybody. I'm glad that you attended today. I'm happy to introduce Professor Shane Strate. Professor Strate is currently a visiting faculty member here at BYU in the History Department, where he teaches courses on South and Southeast Asia. And I'm sure he would be happy to add you to his courses for winter semester. Previously, from 2007 to 2008, Professor Strate was an assistant professor at BYU Hawaii under their visiting faculty member program. He attended Ricks College as an undergraduate before serving a full-time mission in Bangkok, Thailand. He eventually received an MA in history from BYU. In 2006, he returned to Thailand to do dissertation research as a Fulbright Hays dissertation research abroad scholarship recipient or fellowship recipient, and then returned to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he has completed his PhD degree in Southeast Asian history at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is one of the premier institutions for the study of South and Southeast Asia in the United States. So I'll turn the time over to Professor Strate.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that introduction, and thank you, all of you, for attending today. Let's see if I can get this just right. The topic that I'd like to discuss today is a topic which I hope will connect to the important themes that we discuss in our world history courses, our GE courses, the 201s and the 202, namely the large topic of modernization and nationalism. We discuss these movements in the context of non-Western nations who attempt to transform themselves in order to compete with Western nations, particularly in the context of imperialism and colonialism. What I want to discuss today, which is the process of partition, and by partition what I'm referring to is an involuntary process of territorial redefining of these territorial boundaries. This process, I will claim, forms a rupture or a setback in that march towards modernity that these nations are involved in, particularly during the 19th century. Partition, therefore, forms an extremely traumatic experience for these societies, and it leaves a scar on the body of the nation, one that's going to have very important ramifications. As a result, the process of partition requires explanation. It requires a response. It requires a discourse. The formulation of this discourse can hopefully heal the wounds of partition by mobilizing support for its reversal. What my research is designed to show is that this process of partition, this redefinition of territory, gives birth to a corresponding redefinition of the nationalist movement itself. Partition is an opportunity to employ new tactics, new discourses that can enlist mass support. By mobilizing support in defense of the nation, essentially what nationalists are doing is helping to define that nation, or redefine that nation, as it were. Therefore, what I call discourses of partition are a very important lens through which we can examine the evolution of national identity. Now today, we want to talk about two individual cases, and I hope I'm using this right. There we go. Got it mixed up. We're going to look at the Partition of Bengal on the one hand, an event that takes place in 1905, and the Franco Siamese Crisis of 1893, an event which helps give birth to the modern nation of Thailand. Now, both of these regions are working towards modernization and nationalism in the 19th century. There are important differences, obviously, in their conditions. Bengal is an administrative district within the larger state of British India. It is under the control of Western imperialism. Siam, by comparison, is technically independent. It is not yet a modern nation state. It's a system of tributary relationships that holds together the kingdom of Siam. And this is part of the reason that I'm interested in making this comparison, because I want to know how these discourses of partition function together And I'm interested in whether the same patterns that apply to India can also be used to describe uncolonized, quote-unquote, Siam. And I'm interested in knowing how independent Siam really is. I need to make announce two important caveats before we continue. One involves the use of the word partition. Partition is, in the history of South Asia, partition has very strong connotations. It is almost always associated with the partition of 1947 that involves Pakistan and India. You can speak of partition in terms of 1905, the Partition of Bengal, which is usually viewed as a precursor of that larger, more traumatic partition. I'm going to use it very loosely today to describe what happens in Siam as well. In a more formal publication, I would not do that, but today I will. The other is the use of the name Siam or Thailand. Siam refers to the kingdom before 1939, when the name is actually changed to Thailand. So we will try to use the terms in the proper chronological context today. Now, in order to understand partition, we need to understand the process of spatial conceptions and how the concept of organizing and classifying space changes over time in Southeast Asia. Let me show an example. In 1820, the first British trade mission arrives in the Kingdom of Siam, and one of the first things that the British ambassadors ask for is a map of the region. They wanted to be able to understand it, to classify it, to categorize it. And this is the document that the court of Siam provides them. This is the map of the Kingdom of Siam in 1820. Now, this provides none of the information that the British were hoping to receive, of course. But if you are looking from a Siamese perspective, it provides all of the information that is necessary. In the middle, of course, we have the king of Siam. He's very large, which denotes his power, his authority. He holds a trident in one hand, a sphere or globe in the other, representing his authority. All around him are ships, essentially, which are coming to Bangkok, which are coming to Siam because they seek trade, they seek an audience with the king of Siam. This, again, is a symbol of his greatness and his importance in relationship to the surrounding regions. Now, above, you maybe can't see this very well, but this person up here is the king of Burma. The Thais don't like the Burmese. It's very obvious from the depiction here. The king of Burma is much smaller. He has no symbols of power. He's surrounded by many little imp-like creatures, which I assume represents the kingdom of the Burmese. Very negative portrayal, obviously. But this is the purpose of the map, to show the differentiation in the levels of power between the Siamese king and the Burmese king. Now, this is a map that the British expected to see. This is the Western cartographical portrayal of Siam as it exists today. Now, even though it is more familiar to us, and thus we see it as being more rational, it is no less a product of the imagination. In traditional Siamese spatial conceptions, it is only the center that matters. If we go back this way, it is only the center that's important, which is why the king of Siam takes up the map. He is the center. He is power. That's all that matters. The periphery, that does not matter, because boundaries fluctuate and change as the power of the center ebbs and flows. In modern conceptions of space, it is the periphery that is the most important. That is what requires definition. For Westerners, we draw maps using an unseen line that must be clearly delineated. This unseen line corresponds to nothing visible on the ground, but it marks clearly where Burma ends and Siam begins. Throughout the 19th century, one of the greatest triumphs of the imperialist enterprise is the displacement of indigenous spatial conceptions with this more modern way of classifying and categorizing the world. Cartographers from Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, and so on went around surveying and calculating and classifying, establishing fixed boundaries which they believed represented and contained political influence. Modern cartography thereby creates a principle which historians have referred to as the Geo Body, which is a very important concept to the intersection of geography and history. The Geo Body can be explained as the creation of a clearly defined space, and onto that space, which is supposed to represent the nation state itself, we project all sorts of values. We project cultural exceptionalism. We project loyalty, love, bias, hatred, reason or unreason. All of the qualities that define us of a nation are somehow embodied in this particular representation. Therefore, the Geo Body is much more than a two-dimensional image. It provides us with a language. It provides us with something we can use to discuss the fortunes and well-being of the nation. It is a logo of sorts, a source of identification. It is, in fact, a living symbol. And because it is living, because we project onto it all of these anthropomorphic qualities, it can be injured, it can be defeated, it can be subject to violence or humiliation. This is what I mean by discourses of partition. Responses to the violence committed against the Geo Body, which resulted in territorial readjustments. Now, whether we know it or not, if we're students of history, we're probably already familiar with these types of discourses in their various forms. When Hitler, for example, in Mein Kampf, talks about Czechoslovakia, right here, as a dagger thrusting into the belly of Germany. He's sort of, in his irredentist way, he's talking about this type of discourse. When the French talk about Alsace and Lorraine, and talk about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 as though it was an amputation. The body of France has its arm cut off from it, and that must somehow be regained. Again, this is a response to a very traumatic event that did violence to the Geo Body. Today we want to discuss similar acts of violence that partitioned the emerging geobodies of Siam and Bengal. And we want to explore how these two regions responded with their own discourses of partition and how these discourses helped shape the nationalist movement. First example, the Partition of Bengal. In 1905, the government of British India, under Lord Curzon, proposed a plan that would readjust the boundaries of India's wealthiest and most populous administrative district, the region of Bengal. This plan proposed essentially splitting Bengal right down the middle. This is a more modern projection of what the region of Bengal would incorporate today. And this partition line is actually the 1947 partition line, but the 1905 line was quite similar, and it was the basis of that later partition. The plan resulted in the formation of two new administrative districts. In the east, we had the province of Eastern Bengal and Assam, and this province contained a Muslim majority and a Hindu minority. This would obviously be the basis of the eventual nation of Bangladesh. In the west, we had Western Bengal, a new province with a Hindu majority, but which would also include many Bihari and Oriya-speaking peoples. Therefore, Bengali speakers would be a minority in what they considered to be their own region or their own province. Word of Curzon's plan resulted in immediate opposition, and this opposition was organized by the Indian National Congress, who organized rallies and petitions and all sorts of protests, but they were all ineffective, and in 1906, Bengal was divided. This is a map. I don't have a very good map of the 1905 partition, but this is essentially the lines that the eastern province followed. You can see in the boundary essentially follows the Ganges River right here, the city of Calcutta, which had been the foremost center of Bengal before that was also a center of nationalist sentiment, was left in West Bengal. Eastern Bengal was separated, and Dhaka became the capital of that new province. The question we have to ask ourselves is why partition? This, in many ways, gets to the heart of the response to partition. Of course, the interpretation depends on who's giving it. The British partition made the case that Bengal was simply too large to administer effectively. It had to be divided because of the difficulties of distributing information, distributing food. In the case of the Orissa famine in the 19th century, management was simply unequal to the task. If you believe the nationalists, however, there's a much different explanation, one that gets at the heart of partition, which is the concept of divide and rule. They believed the underlying political motive was an attempt to unite Muslim minority against the Hindu majority and encourage Muslim separatism. Now, this is eventually, of course, what happened in 1947. The British, the nationalists claimed that the British also wanted to split the Hindu nationalist movement by creating rival Hindu political centers in East and West Bengal, separating Calcutta, especially the center of revolutionary ferment, from the rest of Eastern Bengal. Now, the reaction in India to partition, once it was carried out, was exactly the opposite of what the British had intended, if you believe, the nationalists. They hoped that it would cripple the Indian National Congress, that it would cripple nationalism. Instead, it served to catapult the Indian National Congress to new levels of popularity. And it led to the beginnings, the origins of the most successful nationalist campaign in India, the Swadeshi movement. Now, you might be familiar with Swadeshi if you've seen the movie Gandhi or if you've looked at the Indian independence movement at all. It actually doesn't originate with Gandhi. It comes out of this partition of Bengal, where the idea of an economic boycott is thought to be the most effective way to sort of combat this idea of partition. This image here is actually from the Gandhi era, from the 1930s, but it expresses the idea of Swadeshi, support local growers, local craftsmen, instead of giving your money away to to British textile mills. Between 1904 and 1908, sales of English cloth decreased 25% as a result of this campaign, while sales of locally made cloth soared. Wearing Swadeshi became a badge of honor among Indian nationalism, those who were invested in the movement. And those who persisted in wearing foreign cloth were subject to all sorts of social ostracism. Now, the next question that we look at is, how can we explain the reaction to the partition of Bengal? This is not the first time that the boundaries of Bengal had been readjusted. It was certainly the most divisive, the most traumatic. But it was not the first unpopular decision that the British had made. And in doing so, the British thought that the reaction to the partition would be exactly the same as what they had previously experienced. There would be some protests, some campaigns, but eventually everything would die down. And this was simply not the case. The British sorely underestimated the effect that partition would have on the population of Bengal. Why? Why in 1905 do we suddenly have such a tremendous upsurge in nationalist sentiment? I think the first factor that we can point to is that the process of partition was deeply humiliating for the elite nationalists of the Bengali region. Before 1905, the nationalist movement of India operated on the precept that there was a sense of association, of coexistence that could pervade the nationalist movement. They were working for greater autonomy, but within the framework of constitutionalism and of the British Empire or Commonwealth. There was a belief that the British would grow to respect Bengali leaders as peers and eventually would come to work with them towards mutual understanding. But the way that partition was carried out, without any debate, without any discussion, without any accommodation for the views of the people involved, began to convince nationalist leaders that, in fact, there could be no working with the British. Their interests were too mutually exclusive, essentially. And Bengalis would remain, under the British, little more than servants in their own country. Therefore, partition essentially dispels this illusion that nationalists have about association, and they begin to talk in terms of Swaraj, independence, self-rule, an India without British influence at all. Now, the second reason, I would argue, is the more important of the reasons. The advent of partition provides nationalists with an issue that transcends the gap between the elite and the masses, between the educated, urban Bajralak of Calcutta and the rural poor, the peasantry of India. Partition allowed them to convey the sense of humiliation that they felt to the masses in a way that they could appreciate, that would be important to them. And the key to this, to understanding this, is that Bengal, of all the regions of India, Bengal has arguably the most highly developed sense of regional identity and a long, proud history of autonomy under the Mughals, under the Delhi Sultanate. Bengal, the history of Bengal was thought to be unique. Bengali identity was much, or the sense of identity was very highly developed in comparison to other regions. The question, of course, was how to define it. How do you pinpoint identity? How do you point to what makes us Bengali? And in partition, the nationalists were giving something very valuable. They were given the idea of the map, the Geo Body, and more specifically, the violence that was being enforced on this Geo Body. Bengali nationalists used this map to represent the tradition of Bengal. If the Geo Body of Bengal was being threatened, if this area, the shaded region with clearly delineated boundaries was being cut in half, then everything associated with Bengal was also under siege. Bengali nationalists used this idea and employed it in a variety of more traditional techniques. Instead of relying exclusively on European conferences and newspapers and speeches, they went out to the village. They set up traditional peasant village fairs or participated in those fairs, set up exhibitions demonstrating Swadeshi goods. They expressed the plight of Bengal, the partition of Bengal, using folk songs, using traditional dramas, and the illustrated lantern slides, or magic lantern slides as they called them at the time, to convey what was happening to Bengal to the people out in the villages. Nationalists used religious language as well to convey this idea of Bengal's partition, particularly using a deity which is very important in Bengal, the goddess Lakshmi. Lakshmi is the consort of Vishnu. In the story of Ramayana, when Vishnu is reincarnated as Rama, it is Lakshmi who is reincarnated as Rama's wife, Sita. Lakshmi is the goddess of fortune, and she is the goddess, Bengalis believe, who has made Bengal great, who has made it one of the wealthiest regions in all of the South Asian continent. As long as Bengal was united in brotherhood, Lakshmi would stay and prosperity would continue. She had previously been close to leaving, nationalists argued, due to the strife between Hindu and Muslim in Bengal. But as long as they could maintain their solidarity, Lakshmi would stay. Now there was a comparable threat to Bengal. The British were dividing Bengal in two. Hindu separated from Muslim, East separated from West, Calcutta separated from Dhaka, and this would make Lakshmi very restless. It would make her ready to leave. Lakshmi could be enticed to stay, however, particularly if Bengali women showed their devotion by performing certain religious rites in deference to Lakshmi. The most important of these was the refusal to purchase British goods. You had to purchase Swadeshi goods, and if you did that, that would be pleasing to Lakshmi. It would be a sign of unity in Bengal, and that would persuade her to stay. There's another important example. I mean, obviously there are many examples, but one that we have time to talk about. Partition is an important theme in the poetry of one of India's greatest poets. Rabindranath Tagore, the poet of India, was a Bengali. And in 1906, he writes a very famous poem, Amar Shonar Bangla, My Beloved Bengal, in which he talks about the threats to Bengal, how Bengal has been divided. And as you can see in the very last stanza, if sadness, O mother of mine, casts a gloom on your face, mine eyes are watered with tears, or filled with tears. Essentially referring to the condition that Bengal found itself in. And Tagore was very vocal in his opposition to partition, and he was very active in the nationalist movement, using this as an issue that could unite, he believed, could unite all of Bengalis, could form a new sense of solidarity where none had existed before. These discourses of partition, or these ways of talking about partition, worked to reassert a form of identity which was based partly on depictions of geographical space, new depictions of that space, and how those depictions were under threat. It asserted that Bengali identity was self-evident, and it was self-evident because you could see it depicted on a map, contained within easily identifiable boundaries and shaded a different color than the rest of the map. That was one way of knowing that it was different. By using these spatial projections, nationalists demonstrated how that identity, the Geo Body, was under attack, or it was in need of protection. And in the process of protecting it, these nationalists, of course, were in fact creating it, were in the process of reconstructing it in a new way. The move to preserve this identity was so strong that the British eventually relented, and they reversed the partition, uniting the two areas of Bengal once again in 1911. Part of what's so fascinating to me about this incident is that this could have been or established a new trajectory for India. One of the things that I'm interested in researching more is partition gives Bengal such a strength, such a form of solidarity, that it seems as though it would move to become its own nation, independent of India. And in fact, there was a movement to do that. There was a movement supported by Subhas Chandra Bose, other famous nationalists, towards establishing a united Bengal, and how that would fit into India, how Bengali nationalism fits in with the larger India nationalism that was later promoted by Gandhi and Nehru and others, is a topic that I'm very interested in and I'd like to learn more about. In 1947, however, the dream of a united Bengal came to an end when Bengal was once again partitioned along the lines of 1905. East Bengal became East Pakistan and eventually Bangladesh. 1905 to this day is still an extremely traumatic moment in the history of India. It is the precursor of the much greater trauma that would come in 1947. Now, of course, that perspective is very different if you are in Bangladesh. 1905 doesn't appear to be something quite so traumatic. Let's look at our second case, the partition of Siam, or the Franco-Siamese Crisis of 1893. At the end of the 19th century, Siam is involved in a very similar project to India. It is in a race to modernize and to develop nationalism, consolidate control over its empire in the hopes that it can avoid losing that empire to Western aggression. And there are very serious threats for the Siamese. In the West, over here, we have the approach of the British from India through Burma into what the Siamese consider to be their territory. In the east, of course, all the blue-shaded territory represents the expansion of the French in Indochina. This is a period of intense modernization for the Siamese. They believe that if they can modernize quickly enough, build railroads, set up universities, develop a national army, and other institutions associated with a modern nation state, that can save them from the powers of imperialism that are enclosing them. The Siamese monarch is very successful in negotiating with the Western threat, with the British. Treaty after treaty negotiations essentially establish a very stable boundary on the west of Siam. They're much less successful in the east, however, with the French. In 1893, the French and the Siamese become involved in a dispute over this territory up here, which today is northern Laos. And they clash over control of this region. Siam actually defends itself quite well in this area, but of course, this is not the end. The French take a gunship from Saigon and they sail it into the Gulf of Thailand, up the Chao Phraya River, and essentially park it outside, or dock it, since it's a boat, outside of the Grand Palace, and use this as a symbol that Siam must either surrender the Lao territories or it must endure a blockade of the Chao Phraya River, which would essentially cut Siam completely off from world trade. Eventually, the king of Thailand realizes that he is in an untenable position, and he concedes, giving away all of the territory, or officially signing away all of this territory here in dark blue, most of which today is the region, or the modern nation state of Laos. These Lao territories then become part of French Indochina up until the 20th century. This is the Franco-Siamese Crisis, the partition of Siam, the loss of this territory. It is the most traumatic event in the modern history of Thailand for several reasons. First, the kingdom loses what is roughly 1/3 of its current territory, forming quite literally a scar on the body of the nation. The monarchy, the symbol of Thailand, of Siam, is humiliated, forced to endure a series of ultimatums. Chulalongkorn actually has to leave his summer palace. He's quite ill at the time. He travels up to Bangkok in order to meet this French ambassador, and as you can imagine, he was not very gracious in victory. Most of all, the loss of this territory proved that the modernization campaign, all of these reforms which the Siamese had been engaged in, appeared to be an illusion. They could not save the country from imperialist aggression. They could not even defeat the colonial army used by the French. And therefore, it challenges this idea, which is sort of at the heart of Thai nationalism as it existed at the time, that the monarchy had power to incorporate Western technology and influence and absorb it into a framework that would preserve Siamese tradition. This event required explanation. How could it have happened? What was the answer? And there were two very important discourses that would result. The very first of these being what I refer to as royal nationalism. This is not a discourse of partition. It is an attempt to do the opposite, to stabilize, an explanation that should stabilize the situation. Royal nationalism seeks to preserve the dignity and the authority of the monarchy by presenting the events of 1893 as a victory. And the logic was very simple. The royalists said, yes, the king surrendered a large amount of our territory, but that was necessary in order to preserve the whole. The finger was cut off, essentially, in order to preserve the hand. And so again, you have these allusions to the body, the nation having a body, and the violence that is done to that body. He did not lose the Lao territories. He wisely sacrificed them for the better interests of the kingdom. This discourse, royal nationalism, becomes the entire basis of what today is the grand narrative of Thai history. This is the idea that the king saved the nation. Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia not to have experienced imperialism because of the wisdom and the diplomatic genius of this individual right here, Rama V, King Chulalongkorn. He is in many ways the father of the nation. The purpose of this narrative is fairly obvious. It solidifies the monarchy's position as the pillar of the nation. The monarchy is at the core of this version of Thai nationalism. And this is the version that you read about if you read any conventional history book on Thailand. My book manuscript proposes the formation of a second competing discourse, which we could describe as a discourse of partition, which also comes out of 1893, but it comes much later. And this is the idea which in Thai is referred to as Sia Dindan, the loss of territory, the lost territories. This narrative doesn't emerge until the end of absolute monarchy, after the military coup of 1932. The new rulers of Thailand, particularly this person right here, Pibun Songkram, the field marshal, the military dictator of Thailand, is quite interested in discrediting the monarchy. He, of course, has to justify his military coup, and he has to come up with a new narrative of Thai history and the monarchy's role in it. And he uses the partition of 1893 to do that. He creates a discourse, which is a discourse of partition, Sia Dindan, which instead of Siam's survival from colonialism, emphasizes a whole series of injustices, of territorial losses, which were endured by Siam, and that Siam survived in spite of all the oppression and the injustice and the violence which was done to it by these European imperialist powers. The end game, essentially, for Pibun is that Siam has not reached this level of civilization. Modernization, a new nationalism is necessary in order to prevent the injustices of the past from recurring again. And so they create this entire dialogue of lost territory, which in fact projects much farther into the past than 1893 and reinterprets Siam's past as a whole series of partitions. So if you're a Siamese nationalist or a Thai nationalist in the 1930s, this is what Siam once looked like. All of this non-gray area was once Siam. But through a series of unfair, unjust events, they lost portion after portion to France. First, eastern Cambodia in 1867 is lost. In 1888, they lose what is today northern Laos to France. Here, of course, is the big loss, the defeat in the Franco-Siamese Crisis of 1893. That is the chosen trauma. That is the central event that motivates this narrative, of course. But they continue on. In 1905, Siam negotiates the end of extraterritoriality by giving even more territory away to French Indochina. And then in 1907, a trade agreement basically gives up what today is Battambang, Siem Reap, and Sisaphone provinces in western Cambodia. All of these losses are portrayed as an integral part of the history of Siam, part of a larger process of humiliation in which Western nations have stolen Thailand and been the source of economic oppression. In my book manuscript, I argue that this discourse of partition, this Sia Dindan, as it is described by the Thais, explains events which would otherwise be which would otherwise appear as complete anomalies if you adopt the grand narrative of royal nationalism. It motivates a series of events that cannot be explained using this accepted historical narrative. One of those is the 1940 war between French Indochina and Thailand. This Sia Dindan discourse mobilizes the entire country in favor of going to war with French Indochina in order to retrieve those lost territories. The Geo Body, which has been partitioned, which has been, or the section which has been amputated, it must be restored. It is symbolic of Siam reaching this greater level of modernity in order to compete with the West. In 1941, Thailand, along with Japan's help, succeeds in annexing small portions of what today are Laos and Cambodia. It is mostly the regions which were lost in 1904 here and 1907 here. Those are returned, and they are celebrated as the return of orphans, the return of the lost territories, and there are massive parades that take place. This discourse on partition, I argue, succeeds in mobilizing an unprecedented level of popular support. The very first mass political rallies which take place in Thailand are a result of this movement to regain the lost territories. This is a much more militant, much more fascist in many ways. Pibun was a big admirer of Mussolini and Hitler, a big supporter of irredentism, obviously. This was a very different brand of nationalism, and it reached down into the villages in a way that was difficult for other forms of nationalism. In addition, during World War II, the discourse of partition, of Sia Dindan, is used to explain why the Thai government aligns itself with Japan. Thailand and Japan had really very few historical relations. Thailand was much more closely knit to Britain, and yet all of a sudden in 1942 it declares war on Britain. This propaganda poster explains why, using this discourse of partition. Essentially what the explanation there is that Britain wants to use Thailand as a shield to protect its colonies in Burma and in Singapore, and it wants to have Thailand destroyed so that it can reinforce itself. This is the Japanese soldier here on the left. The following slide says, Japan is our true friend. Japan has never stolen territory away from us the way that the British have and the French have. And therefore, our interests lie not with Western imperialism. Our interests are in Pan-Asianism. And so you have this sort of interesting anomaly of an uncolonized Asian power, which is sort of embracing this idea of Japanese imperialism or Pan-Asianism, however you want to describe it, under the guise that Japan has never injured us. Japan has never stolen our territory. This discourse of partition serves to reinforce what is really a given political reality. All right, what final conclusions can we draw from these two case studies? In both cases, I think we could use the examples to say that partition is deeply humiliating to the nationalist movement because it dispels this illusion among nationalists that progress is being made, that they are close to achieving a level that would allow them to compete with Western powers and to achieve autonomy. In India, this illusion was the idea that they could work with the British, or that the British would work with them as equals. In Thailand, this illusion involved the power of modernizing reforms to civilize the country and protect it from imperialist aggression. In both cases, the various partitions that we described proved that this simply was not the case and that new methods and tactics would have to be undertaken. New ideologies would have to emerge. Partition provides an important issue which is used to facilitate contact with the masses. It is an issue that everyone can understand and appreciate and rally around. The idea of a homeland being divided, of brother being separated from brother, this is something that everyone can appreciate. And as I mentioned before, it is so successful in Thailand that there are demonstrations and rallies all over the country in the 1940s in support of regaining these lost territories. The idea of partition has become meaningful to a new generation in the way that it wasn't to the individuals who actually witnessed it happen in 1893. This is shows the power, I argue, of this discourse. And then finally, it's not just about land. I think you can look at the evidence and say, well, any time a nation loses land, it's going to require, or it's going to meet with a violent reaction. And in the case of Thailand particularly, that's just not the case. They sign away land to Britain, they sign away land to France. None of it succeeds in provoking this level of resentment because it's more about the way that land is taken. It's more about the humiliation involved in the process. Even in the case of Bengal, those boundaries had been readjusted before. certainly not to the same extent that they were in 1905, but is the arrogance which with the plan is carried out, which is interpreted as such an affront to the nationalist movement in these particular regions. Land is symbolic, and especially the way that it is depicted on a map. It is symbolic, or the power to take away land from a country is symbolic of that country's inferior status. And therefore, these discourses of partition argue that only by restoring what was lost can improvement be made and the status of the nation be made whole again. Thank you. Do we have time for some questions, if anyone has a question? Mark, thank you.
My question is, when does partition end? When is partition accepted and become part of the past rather than remaining part of the present?
That's a good question. I would argue that it never ends. This discourse still continues today in both India and in Pakistan. I'm sorry, in Pakistan too, but also in Thailand. A couple of months ago, I received a PowerPoint presentation produced by an anonymous source, I don't know who it was, which provided all of the events in which Thailand had lost territory to imperialist powers. And it went way back to events that I never would have conceived of as being part of this territory or this process of partition. And it still exists because it's still useful. It fuels many of the conservative political issues that are flourishing in Thailand today, particularly the suspicion of the West, this idea that, the West is out to get us, imperialism is still alive and rampant. Partition is still very useful in creating concern about that. Yes?
Is the discourse made more contemporary in the sense that now it's no longer France as the boogeyman, but rather it's Laos and Cambodia, which have which control historically Thai territory?
Yeah, there are always border conflicts between Laos and Cambodia, as there are between India and Pakistan. Obviously, Kashmir is a huge problem that goes back to the similar process of how do you partition. But it's even more abstract. It's even more ethereal in that sense that partition is used to describe a greater threat. In Thailand's case, that threat is globalization. That, the Asian crisis of 1998 to about 2002, that was the perfect opportunity for conservative politicians to resurrect this idea of loss of territory, of Sia Din Dan. Look what the West has done to us. Look what the West is still doing to us. And so in that sense, you can use it in many different ways, in ways that are abstract and maybe don't have to do with territory at all. Yes?
So I'm interested in how you think this discourse on partition applies to the current situation with the border provinces in Cambodia today. So what's your take on the different actors in Thailand and how they have used this discourse or not used it or gone against the discourse in this problem?
Right. Well, there was, that's a very good question. There was in 2006 the border issue between Cambodia and Prawihan, or Pravihir as the Cambodians call it, flared up all over again in terms of ownership over this particular Hindu temple. And that event, Thailand's willingness to give up their claim to that temple and allow it to be a World Heritage Site under Cambodian ownership, ignited this whole debate that we've been talking about in terms of lost territory, because that temple was part of land which was forced to be ceded to France. And by giving up that temple, it was interpreted as a sign of weakness. on Thailand's part. And therefore, it was interpreted as though Thailand was not able to defend itself. Thailand was weak. And the enemy was not necessarily Cambodia, but the enemy was this process of which Cambodia simply became a symbol. And that almost led, as you probably already know, to the fall of the government in Thailand in 2006, and it led to the resignation of the foreign minister who had approved giving ownership of that temple over to Cambodia. It's still disputed to this day. So, are we all right? Thank you.